Hey, everybody. Welcome to this live edition of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We are so glad that you're here, and we have a really exciting show for you today. You're going to be loving this. We have with us today, live from Washington, D.C., the the editorial director of Responsible Statecraft, Kelley Vlahos, who is also the senior advisor at the Quincy Institute, one of the great new foreign policy think tanks that's actually talking about how to have a rational foreign policy that benefits America and doesn't drag us into stupid wars. I mean, maybe there's a better way to put it, but
no,
that's
I
what
love
it is
that
to
way.
me.
That's perfect. I'm putting it on a bumper sticker or a
That's
t-shirt.
great. That's awesome. Yeah, but really, really glad to have you here, Kelley. And just for those who don't know, Kelley and I have known each other for over a decade, and I've admired her work for all of that time. She's worked for 17 years for Fox News earlier in her career. So there's hardly anybody that's has better understanding of American foreign policy, the things that are important to our country. Being in there in Washington, D.C., she's gotten to know a few people. So she has some pretty good ideas, some things that are going on behind the scenes that a lot of us may not know about, just looking at the news. And that's why we're excited to have her here today. And, man, we really can't talk about anything without talking about the chaos and the potential disaster that's politically unfolding right now, just miles away from where you're sitting in the U.S. Capitol, with the decision to vacate the Speaker of the House, Mike McCarthy, and now all the intrigue going on behind the scenes. It's trying to get ready for next Wednesday's vote. I mean, what do you think about what's going on with that? Do you have any insight as to where they may go and who may win the next speakership?
I like you said, I've been at this beat for 20 something years. I don't want to date myself too much. And I've seen a lot of crazy stuff in this town, but I feel like after 2016 and the election of Trump, I'm not surprised anymore when norms are broken, like the one that we just saw with the speaker being vacated, thrown out on his keister. That was an historic moment. There are a ton of question marks about what happens next. I think the biggest thing that I'm focused on right now as editor of Responsible Statecraft is what happens with the Ukraine aid. We know how important it is for the Biden administration and supporters of the aid, particularly in the Senate on both the Republican and Democrat side, to get another aid package passed for Ukraine. And McCarthy was hard to read on this. He had said months ago, no blank check for Ukraine. He actually resisted successfully having Zelensky come here and make another joint speech to Congress. But on the other hand, he has told Zelensky himself while he was in Ukraine a few months ago that they would get what they needed. Now it's not so ambiguous. The guys that are up for the job, that have thrown their hats into the ring, Congressman Scalise, Hearn, Emmer, and Jim Jordan, have all been staunchly against more Ukraine aid. So that issue is really up in the air. We have a great story on Responsible Statecraft today about some of the procedural things that supporters of the aid could actually take advantage of and try to make an end run around the new speaker to get the aid passed. It's not going to be easy because a lot of that would require Democratic buy-in, and I don't think Republican members, as much as they might support giving more aid to Ukraine, are readily interested in working with Democrats or having that taint their record. So
right. So this is a really complicated situation, even more so than I think ever before, because I see three different dynamics playing in, and wonder how you see those things congealing. Is the first one is the American public seems to be drifting less and less towards supporting, overall towards the, continued aid to Ukraine. And it's much stronger among the rank and file Republican voters, at least according to most of the polls. Within the second one, within the Republican conference itself, you have some really staunch supporters of supporting Ukraine, like McConnell over in the Senate, and certainly many in the House as well. But you also have a lot of really staunch opponents of that, like Matt Gaetz and his merry little band of rebels. And then I don't even know, maybe some people are falling in between. But then on the other side of it with the Democrats, because, Biden is supporting this, so you can expect that the party itself would generally be behind it. But now then, because of how this whole thing played out, first of all, with the CR and McCarthy having to work with the Democrats to get around those rebels to get that signed. And now that everybody's saying, don't make any more deals with the Democrats or whatever. So how is this thing going to play out? How does even the different constituents want it to play out?
It's really tough because you really hit the head on the nail there, or hit the nail on the head. The base of the party outside of the Beltway is increasingly wary of the Ukraine aid, the Ukraine policy, prolonging the war for various reasons. And we can get into that. But as you see in poll after poll, Republican voters are very disenchanted. And so they're dragging that number down. So even today, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll that showed a marked decline in support for further Ukraine aid. There was another poll yesterday by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that found another smaller but marked decline. Majority of Americans in that poll still say, over 50% say, keep the aid going. But the decline is being dragged down by Republicans. And so you have Republicans on the Hill. The majority of Republicans on the Hill today support aid. They have actually advocated for more than what the Biden administration has even given them. And they probably put U.S. troops on the ground if given their druthers. But they're not reflecting.
Let's make sure they don't get their druthers, Dan. Let's oppose that.
But the thing is, they're not reflecting the voters. They're not reflecting the base. So you have this contradiction between the people, in this case, Republicans, conservatives, outside the Beltway, and your official, elite class, political class.
Okay. So speaking of that, we have a potential disturbing alignment of the elites on the left and the right. Here's one of the elite on the Democratic side, which sounds very similar to what you're describing, some of the elites on the Republican side. And well, this by itself is disturbing, but take a listen.
There's an ideological and sadly partisan political divide. And I know that the majority of Congress is still in favor of supporting Ukraine. So we've got to get through this period. We have to pass legislation and continue to support. And, Jeff, this fight is our fight. Honestly, I don't understand any American siding with Putin, but we've seen it and we've heard it, and we have to fight against it.
Well, now I'll just tell you, Kelley, that this just rubs me the wrong way, just because of that word you use is rolling around in my mind. This elitist attitude that basically dismisses anyone who doesn't support funding this war and perpetually funding Ukraine on this side. So you can't have a valid question about this stuff, or there's something wrong with you and you're supporting Putin, whatever. Do you see any of that also at the elite Republican side? And then how do we get it to where you have the two sides together, weirdly enough, in Washington, separate from what a lot of the American people are thinking?
Well, I mean, this is so indicative of why the Democrats lost in 2016 and will continue to lose on many levels, is because they just assume they know right. And the way she vocalized this, that we have to push this through, we know best, not we should explain or argue to the American people our point of view and try to convince them of the necessity. It's more like, hey, we know what we got to do. And it's really our challenge to just ram it through, whether or not the American people agree. And this is why there is a revolution right now among the people against Washington, because, and whether it's Hillary Clinton or it's Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham or any other hawk on the right, they talk in terms of we know better. and you go about your business. You do your thing. You watch your Golden Bachelor and your sports and go to work every day. We'll handle the business of foreign policy here in Washington. And I think it rubbed the wrong way. I think it has actually incited a lot of anger against Washington, and that's why you've seen the rise of someone like Donald Trump in 2016, because they said, Washington doesn't speak for me. They not only don't speak for me, they condescend to me. And they tell me my point of view is not only wrong, but it's treasonous. And that my point of view about what my taxpayer money should be paying for is actually pro-Putin. I mean, it's outrageous. And I don't think it makes the divide in this country worse. They talk about the conservatives and MAGA, and reinforcing the divide. It's comments like that from Hillary Clinton that say that back people into a corner, and they're forced to take sides.
Yeah, and that actually kind of tails into one of the other topics we want to talk about here, and really you see how these things are all kind of intertwined. Is that in the desire to become the next president, you have on the Republican side a number of leaders in various capacities. One of the depending on which poll you look at, DeSantis is kind of running number 2 right now, and he kind of distinguishes himself from Trump. What Trump has said that you just talked about there, he's kind of saying, hey, here's what the people think, and he's kind of resonating with that. But here's what DeSantis is saying.
When I hear some of the rhetoric that is being done, saying that this is kind of the freedoms on the line, all this stuff, you got to win. They don't define what winning is. But to me, that opens the door to say we need to have U.S. troops in there to be able to, finish the job. And I don't think U.S. troops should be involved.
Do you think that's right? Is there really any talk about, funding or supporting Ukraine to the extent that maybe U.S. troops can go on there? Or is this just something to get headlines?
I don't think there's any talk about it, but it's always sort of at the fringes of the conversation. I honestly feel that leaders like Lindsey Graham in the Senate, for example, maybe even Nikki Haley running for president, if there was seriously on the table, if say that there was an incident across the border into a NATO country, and there was this question of whether or not NATO needed to finally get involved directly, I'm not so sure those people, Lindsey Graham, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, and the others, wouldn't be in support of NATO, which would mean U.S. troops on some level getting directly involved. I don't trust that. I think that there's been so much rhetoric thrown around since the beginning of this war about the U.S. obligation, its role, what we could do for Ukraine that we're not doing now, that I'm not so sure it wouldn't lead in that direction. I do think poll after poll after poll show that American people do not want U.S. troops on the ground. And that's when you see the numbers just plunge. So most Americans support some sort of aid, particularly humanitarian aid. And I'm not against humanitarian aid. But when you work in the question about U.S. troops, zoom, that number goes way down. And if you're a politician who's actually has any strategic thought, you're going to be like, I don't want to go there.
Yeah, and DeSantis actually touched on part of it there, and we've heard it from a number of other leaders and other people we've talked about on this show in the past. Is that especially coming from the current administration? What's the strategy? What's your expectation? And that's more than just a little important, because if your objective is synonymous with what Kiev's is, which has been stated routinely throughout this war by Zelensky, it's the eradication of all Russian forces from all Ukrainian territory to include Crimea. Well, now, if you start getting into that, then you run the risk. I mean, first of all, I don't think that's a realistic strategy at all, because I don't see any capacity militarily to get there. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that somehow it can be found, and over time, maybe Russia starts to weaken and Ukraine starts to succeed. And now then Ukraine actually does drive Russia out in large numbers. I mean, then the risk and the possibility of escalation goes through the roof from the Russian side, potentially in nuclear weapons use, tactical nuclear weapons, which right now I don't think there's any chance of at all, because they don't have any need for it. But if you started succeeding in this path, two things. First of all, you would drive the risk of nuclear escalation through the roof that's way outside of any kind of utility for America. And then on the contrary side of that, if that's your objective and Ukraine starts to lose and Russia starts to win, which I argue is a much better probability, now then what is Washington going to do? Are we going to escalate and then talk about troops on the ground? Or are we going to say, yeah, we failed and leave in humiliation? You see the conundrum that would come here, which both of which has the potential for escalation of the U.S. side.
Absolutely. I hope it doesn't get to that point. I do think the American people are smarter than those in Washington. And like I said, you see in the polls, even when you're asked questions like, should both sides start moving towards a diplomatic solution, in particular to avoid a long war or an escalation or a direct conflict with Russia. I don't have the poll in front of me, but I remember this one within the last 6 months. And you did see both Democratic and Republican voters saying, yeah, I would like to see a diplomatic solution rather than something escalating to a direct conflict between the United States and Russia. I think that there is a palpable fear of that happening. I think that argument works very well. Now, if it did escalate, I'm hoping, that the Republicans who have been more on the restraint side of this issue increasingly, now it's over the issue of Ukraine aid. But I'm thinking that there are a number of very vocal conservatives here in Washington that would push back on a direct involvement of the United States. And it might be just over political reasons. They don't want to follow the Democratic president into a war. Well, and if it's over politics, then fine, because I just don't want to see another war.
Exactly. But it appears that one of those people might not be Nikki Haley, because as you kind of alluded to, she seems to be a little bit more on the hawkish side. And in fact, regarding some of these issues, she had this to say.
President Trump used to have it right when it came to Russia and Ukraine. He reversed the Obama strategy and he sent Javelin missiles to Ukraine, and I was proud to serve with him then. He's now backtracked now and is going into where he's weak in the knees on Russia again. You've got Vivek Ramas Swami, who basically wants to side with a murderer over a pro-America, freedom-loving country. That doesn't make sense. You've got Ramaswamy who wants to cut aid to Israel. He doesn't understand that it's not that America needs Israel. It's not that Israel needs America. America needs Israel. They're the front line of defense for Iran. He wants to feed Taiwan to China. He's missing all the points of, you can't be so narcissistic to think America doesn't need allies. We do need allies.
Okay. I mean, whoever said that we don't need allies? I mean, I think that's almost a straw man thing, but man, there's a lot to unpack there. What do you say to Nikki Haley's comment that basically anyone who wants to have a moderate foreign policy on this stuff is, quote, wanting to feed Taiwan to China or weaken the knees, as she accused President Trump of being, on Russia? I mean, what do you say to those kind of things?
Well, I mean, I would just say, wow, I would just switch out Taiwan for the Taliban, and let's switch out Saddam Hussein for Putin. Nikki Haley is part of a pantheon of Republican voices, and Democrat too. You had Hillary Clinton on here a few moments ago, who have been talking the same language for 20 years. She and others were saying the same darn thing about weakness on Iraq, weakness on Osama bin Laden during the war on terror. If you weren't full throttle in favor of invading Iraq, that somehow you are defeatist, you were a traitor to your country, you were an unpatriotic conservative, as they called Pat Buchanan at the time. And so this is just warmed over neoconservative slop. And they're feeding it to the American people as though we don't know better. Now, maybe if you're a younger person and you didn't live through the war on terror, the war in Iraq, you weren't around for all the arguments and for all of the propaganda that was going on in this country, the media cheerleading, the neoconservative voices that were everywhere, predominating the airways. You might think that she sounds strong, that somehow she's making arguments of peace through strength. They keep throwing Reagan around, but right. You and I know better. This is not new. And I'd like, here she's talking about Obama. I remember when Obama was berated by John McCain in a Senate hearing for not being tougher on Putin. Obama was backed into a corner, and that's when he started giving those javelins over. And I remember thinking, and I wasn't a big fan of Obama either. I'm just not a big fan of politicians in general. And I remember thinking, wow, they're really going after him. They were calling him weak. They were saying that, the bear, like he was afraid of the bear. And I said, wow. And here I have yet to see anything that Obama did have any fruitful impact on the relationship with Russia. It just made them more aggressive, the more buildup of their military. And we do it in response saying, well, we have to have deterrence. Their way is an old way, and it's not working, and it didn't work. Russia still invaded Ukraine. And here's Nikki Haley saying, we want more aggressive action.
We just weren't hard enough. Now, here's one of those younger voices who appears to have some things right, but there may be some things he's missing too. Let's just take a look at this from Ramas Swami.
My concern is that our steps and NATO's steps right now are marching us closer to world war by driving Russia further into China's hands at a time when we have no visibility into what Russia's red lines are, and further at a moment when Russia has a larger nuclear stockpile and super EMP capabilities and hypersonic missile capabilities ahead of that of the U.S. And so what I've said is I would end that war, but on terms that end the Russia-China partnership. That is also how we deter Xi Jinping from going after Taiwan.
Now, I certainly agree with him that we should, not be poking the bear, so to speak, and not be, wantonly rushing into situations that could backfire on us. You and I talked about that just a second ago. But do you think he's over the top on, warnings about World War III? And he also seems to be closer to what we think is a good idea on the Russia-Ukraine situation, but he seems to be a lot more hawkish on the Chinese side. I wonder if you see any of that contradiction there.
This is what I fear. I fear that a lot of these restrainers on the right who have taken their cues from Donald Trump, who came out in 2016 and said, I'm against endless wars, regime change wars. We got to change our trajectory. We got to bring things home. I feel like they have that urge, to profess restraint, but at the same time, they're nervous about being perceived as being weak. And so they're training their fire on China instead. And so they say, yes, we need restraint on Ukraine. This is not in America's interest to be prolonging this war here because we want to shift our resources and train our fire on Xi Jinping. And I personally do not agree with that. And I know that there's a dynamic argument right now on the right about how much of a threat China is and how we confront it. I am a restrainer. So I am all about being clear-eyed about the competition and even the threats that China might, convey to us. But I'm not about going to war with China over it, or even building up to the point that we trigger a war. And I feel like some of these people, and maybe even Vivek as well, want to have it both ways. They want to talk about national interest and America first on foreign policy when it comes to Ukraine, which in that case would mean not pushing the envelope and not escalating, but they're talking in terms of escalation with China. And I think that that's a political calculation because their right flank, the Nikki Haley's and Pence and Chris Christie are calling them weak. And so they got to prove that they're tough on something.
And Man, this is just it irks me to no end because I see this same almost contradiction, whether it's the right or the left. They're looking at this issues. I mean, I've seen a lot of people that, politicians that say a lot of what I think is absolutely the right thing on how we should approach the issue with the Russia Ukraine war, with our relations with Russia, going forward, because we're going to have to live together once this is over, no matter how it ends. Russia isn't going away. So, let's do something sane. But then they'll turn around and they'll talk about so that we can focus all this on China. And gracious, there is no greater threat to us self-immolating than by throwing ourselves into a completely unnecessary and avoidable war in China. And look, there's every reason in the world why we should aggressively compete with China, and we should do what we can to hold them accountable when they do things like steal intellectual property, when they, do like cyber attacks against us. Absolutely, we should do everything we can to defend our interests there in the diplomatic and economic realms, not in the military realms. It makes no sense. And I keep trying to tell anyone who will listen, Kelley, that there's very practical, graphic military realities that even in this so-called successful attack or fight against China on defense of Taiwan, which is the focal point of all this, is that it would leave us so weakened and devastated, even if we, so-called prevented China from actually invading Taiwan or completely taking it, is that it would cause us so much more damage, both militarily and economically would be off the charts. Why would anyone who's looked at any kind of studies about the ramifications and the consequence of any war between China and Taiwan, even if we stay out of it, why would anyone want to get into that when it's going to just make us go from this kind of harm to under the table kind of harm? It makes no sense. And yet so many people seem aggressive in that direction.
Yeah. And we probably need a whole other show to unpack where the right is on China. And, as an editor of a magazine at a transpartisan organization, I have to be open to arguments on both sides, and I have to make arguments for both sides. And this is a tough one. I feel like I'm glad to hear you say that, Danny. And I think that you got to keep that drumbeat going. I know that Doug McGregor feels the same way. I think we need more experts like yourself and influencers on the right making that case, because I think it's an open space right now. Because, Donald Trump, for all the good he did on spreading the word about ending endless wars and not getting involved in regime change across the globe and not being the world's policeman, he was a little bit ambiguous on his China policy. He was very tough on China on trade and economic policies. He didn't really advocate going to war with China, but I'm not sure he was clear enough about having the same sort of restraint principle applied to China when it came to its military. And that's probably because the U.S. military industrial complex is all about preparing for war with China. And they have convinced everybody in this town that it's coming. Right. And that if we don't talk tough and look tough and put tons of money into new weapon systems and building up our assets in the region, then we're weak and we have this massive blind spot. And I'm with you, Danny. I think the more that we do that and the more build up and the more aggressive we are, the more the Chinese will build up, and then that would trigger something unanticipated. My husband, Michael, and, I know he's been on your show. He's convinced, as many others who are much smarter than me in this town, that the military wants to prepare for a war with China, but they don't want to go to war with China for all the reasons why you just said.
Yeah.
But at what point do they lose it? The control over the situation. That's what makes me nervous.
Yeah, my worry is that the politicians who are responsible for pulling those triggers or making the decisions don't have that reasonable fear about the consequences of taking these kinds of actions. And that's been my big concern. Is I even hear a lot of senior politicians actually talk dismissively about the possibility of a nuclear confrontation or accelerating into nuclear conflict. Like, oh, that wouldn't happen, right, because they know that we would retaliate. You're willing to go there? There is too little fear of the consequences of a nuclear strike that is really problematic to me on both sides.
Right. And, you know, and I know we've talked about this many times, is like you have this sort of self-licking ice cream cone where the money is all coming in for these new weapon systems that are all geared to face the China challenge. Now, you are a leader in the Pentagon of one program or the other, and you're not going to say, nah, maybe this program doesn't need all that money because we don't want to trigger something, or we want to anticipate consequences. At some point, it's on autopilot, and it's self-sustaining, and there's nobody out there to actually say the emperor wears no clothes. It's just sort of like, hey, if you want this job and you want to advance, you're just going to have to go the flow. And we have another story up today about 80% of 4-star generals are retiring and going to work for the defense industry, whether it's on boards of, you know, the boards of directors, or like literally lobbying, you know, for these companies through consulting. So again, you know, they're not going to take the high road and say, maybe we shouldn't be pushing the envelope. They're going to make sure that those companies that they're working for are getting all the contracts, and those contracts exist on the fear that we are losing our competitive edge with China.
Yep. That, you know what, that's going to be one of our topics of a deep dive next week, in that very article that you're mentioning there in the Washington Post. And we're going to talk that in, and I'd love to have you back on another show where we can literally talk, you know, solely about this whole China issue and whether we should or shouldn't go to war and what the consequences would be. As you said, there's a lot to unpack there, but we're going to leave it there for today. And we're going to thank you so much for joining us, you at home. And Kelley, we're so great to have you here, and look forward to having you back.
I'm honored to be here on your new show.
Glad, appreciate that. Well, that is all we have time for today. And we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.